Olá, bom dia a todas, a todos. Nós vamos dar início, então, a essa sessão, conferência, né, do professor Klaus Dörre, professor de Sociologia da Universidade Friedrich-Schiller, em Jena, na Alemanha. Eu queria agradecer a presença de todos e todas, o empenho da diretoria da ANPOCS para viabilizar a vinda do professor Dörre aqui a Caxambu e para a participação dele aqui na ANPOCS, e agradecer também, sobretudo, o Klaus, que conseguiu, no meio de uma agenda apertada de visita ao Brasil, ele está fazendo um tour pelo Rio de Janeiro e por São Paulo, participou de vários eventos, seminários, discussões nas últimas 2 semanas, vi também a ANPOCS, uma oportunidade, me parece, ímpar, né, tanto para que ele possa conhecer um pouco dos nossos debates, como também possamos ter acesso à análise tão interessante, vocês verão, que o professor Dörre tem feito nos últimos anos. A conferência se titula The New Landnahme, From the End of Globalization to the Limits of the Capitalist Dynamic. Klaus vai falar em inglês, né, de maneira o mais lenta e possível, né, para que todos possam entender. E é um prazer enorme poder introduzir de maneira rápida, né, o Klaus Dörre nessa conferência, porque me parece que a crise de 2008 trouxe o capitalismo de volta para o centro do debate das ciências sociais. Nos últimos anos, são várias as tentativas de caracterizar a crise iniciada em 2008, sua multidimensionalidade, a crise ecológica, a crise alimentar, os atores envolvidos. Uma discussão me parece interessante também por tentar tensionar os efeitos da crise no norte e no sul global, e uma certa tensão aí, né, entre discussão, por exemplo, sobre precariedade, precarização muito forte em determinados debates no norte, ao mesmo tempo que a América Latina, a África e a Ásia retoma-se muitas vezes discussões já clássicas sobre marginalidade, informalidade, discussão sobre heterogeneidade estrutural, no bojo de um novo momento histórico, né? São muitos os autores, os diagnósticos que têm tratado o momento contemporâneo como uma inflexão histórica importante, marcada pela transição de uma nova formação capitalista, definidas por alguns como mercantilização, por outros como economização do social. E é nesse debate sobre o novo espírito do capitalismo, que envolve também os limites, né, das dinâmicas e das discussões prévias sobre globalização, onde se situa a contribuição do professor Klaus Dörre e alguns de seus colaboradores em Viena e outros lugares da Alemanha. Me parece que há talvez 3 méritos ou 3 ideias ou questões bastante originais da contribuição do professor Klaus Dörre, que ficarão claras, me parece, na conferência dele, mas que vale a pena destacar. O primeiro, a tentativa de decifrar com precisão, me parece, o capitalismo contemporâneo e a formação social emergente, diferenciando-se tanto do mainstreaming, né, econômico, como inclusive de algumas outras perspectivas ditas contra-hegemônicas ou críticas. Estávamos conversando antes, né, como a própria obra do Wolfgang Streeck chegou bastante ao Brasil, ao restante da América Latina, e o diálogo deles é intenso na Alemanha, é intenso na Europa, e pouca dessa crítica que o próprio Klaus tem feito aos livros e à obra do Wolfgang Streeck chegou ao Brasil, não chegou praticamente nada disso, e me parece que é uma polêmica muito relevante para entender também determinados limites, né, dessa discussão. Nesse sentido, boa parte dos textos que estão em alemão, né, dessa discussão entre os dois, tem um potencial interessante para nossos debates sobre o tema. A segunda questão eu acho, a sensibilidade histórica e teórica do trabalho do Klaus Dörre, que tem tentado fazer, então, uma teoria sociológica do capitalismo, com e para além do Marx, da Rosa Luxemburgo, da Hannah Arendt, do Polanyi, do Harvey, autores com os quais dialoga profundamente. Há aqui uma tentativa bastante criativa de compreensão do desenvolvimento capitalista como uma sucessão do que ele tem chamado de Landnahme. de espaços não capitalistas. Né? Nessa rediscussão do debate clássico, né, sobre acumulação primitiva, essa noção de landnamen, que tem uma difícil tradução a outros idiomas, né? Mas que literalmente significa apropriação de terras, né? Tomada de terra, ganho territorial, ela aproxima-se bastante do debate sobre land grabbing, que é um debate que nos estudos rurais, estudos agrários, tem sido muito forte nos últimos 10, 15 anos, né? Mas me parece que ela avança ainda mais porque tem um potencial teórico empírico muito forte ao sustentar que as sociedades capitalistas não podem se reproduzir sobre seus próprios fundamentos a longo prazo. Né? Para se reproduzirem, elas têm que ocupar continuamente e mercantilizar um outro, não capitalista, regiões, arredores, grupos, atividades. Então, há uma incessante repetição do ato de acumulação primitiva, que é discutida teoricamente, mas também empiricamente pelo Klaus Dörre no trabalho dele no grupo que ele dirige em Iena, que é um grupo muito interessante de pesquisa, denominado Grupo de Sociedades Pós-Crescimento. Né? É lá onde o Klaus é pesquisador, é lá onde ele tem feito boa parte das suas atividades de pesquisa. Um terceiro e último elemento que eu queria chamar a atenção é como esse debate, então, mais amplo e mais teórico, né, sobre a formação e desenvolvimento do capitalismo, localizado no nosso momento contemporâneo, ele tem se conectado na trajetória do Klaus Dörre com uma sociologia pública. Né? Eu acho que isso é um elemento crucial da trajetória do Dörre, de alguns colegas alemães, né? Essa tentativa de decifrar o debate para além da academia, intervir no debate público, intervir no debate político de maneira qualificada, de maneira crítica, inclusive estimulando reflexões dentro de um campo anticapitalista alemão e europeu. Mostra disso um programa de rádio que o próprio Klaus conduz, a edição que ele acaba de assumir da revista Global Dialogue, que foi uma iniciativa do Michael Borway na ISA, na Associação Internacional de Sociologia, e a partir de agora o Klaus Dörre é o novo editor, e uma vinculação com os movimentos sociais concretos, que permite que a atualização da teoria crítica, né, na Alemanha e no mundo hoje não seja feita de maneira tão abstrata, tão filosófica e desvinculada da realidade social, da concretude das possibilidades de transformação. Né? Eu acho que essa é uma característica importante do Klaus Dörre, com o qual coincido plenamente. E só por citar algumas referências, né, que permitem entender então essa obra recente, essa contribuição dele, eu destacaria sobretudo pela relevância e pelo impacto que teve um livro que foi publicado primeiro em alemão e traduzido pela Verso na Inglaterra, que chama Sociological Critique and Capitalism, que foi co-escrito com outros dois colegas, né, do Klaus na Alemanha, um deles Hartmut Rosa, que tem um trabalho muito interessante sobre a teoria da aceleração, da ativação do tempo, né, na modernidade contemporânea. Um livro que gerou muitas discussões, né, na Alemanha e na Europa, de maneira geral. Um capítulo talvez mais rico desse livro do Klaus foi traduzido ao português e publicado recentemente na revista Direito e Praxis. É uma forma para aqueles que quiserem conhecer uma síntese, né, um pouco do argumento do livro, e alguns textos têm sido publicados também recentemente em espanhol, em várias revistas da América Latina. Esperamos que no curto prazo outros textos do Klaus possam ser também divulgados entre nós aqui no Brasil. E nesse sentido, então, tenho pouco mais a dizer. Parece que o melhor é ouvir nosso convidado de hoje. Então, queria agradecer novamente o Klaus, a presença de vocês, e dar a palavra para que ele possa iniciar a conferência de hoje. Agradecendo também a mediação do Guilherme Leite, colega e amigo do Rio de Janeiro, que trouxe, na verdade, possibilitou a vinda do Klaus Dörre ao Brasil. Obrigado, Klaus.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, first of all, allow me to express how delighted I am to meet you all in Caxambu. I feel very honored to be invited to speak here today at this conference with its rich tradition, so rich in tradition. And let me say, Without your invitation, I wouldn't have found Caxambu till the end of my life. It was really an adventure to drive by car to Caxambu at night. Yeah, I will never forget. I got it for the rest of my life. Okay, and the best thing is I have a drive backwards to Rio de Janeiro today. Yeah. Okay. Today I would like to present a concept which I think may serve as a bridge between the discourses both in South and North, namely my concept of capitalist Landnahme. There is no way to translate Landnahme into English in the full sense, and I don't know if it is possible in Portuguese, but I think it's not, yes. And so I use the term Landnahme, yes? Perhaps you can speak it. Landnahme, all together. Landnahme, yeah, very, very good, yes. Works well. Great triumph for all Germans, yeah. One term put into the space, the scientific space in Brazil. That's wonderful for us, because we are very provincial in Germany. Okay. The term Landnahme is of significance to social theories which analyze and criticize capitalism as an expansive system, a metaphor for the expansive dynamic of capitalism and modernity. As a social scientific category, the Landnahme theorem rests on the assumption that capitalist societies cannot reproduce themselves from within, compelling them to rely on the constant occupation of a non-capitalist other. According to this hypothesis, doesn't work, why? I have it. According to this hypothesis, any burst of economic growth can be described as a phase of specific Landnahme pursued by the expanding industrial market-based segments of national economies, and indeed the world economy too. In this context, land does not denote actual physical land, but rather serves as a metaphor for modes of production, life forms, bodies of knowledge and natural resources which are not yet fully subjected to capitalist commodity exchange. Clearly related to terms such as valorization, real subsumption, colonization, and imperialism, the Landnahme theorem largely addresses the non-linearity and limits of capitalist development. The dynamization and self-stabilization of capitalism is essentially impossible without the appropriation and possibly even active manufacture of a non-capitalist other. This is the idea of David Harvey, yeah? I think you know it. If we understand the capitalist dynamic as a sequence of Landnahmen, then it's also accurate to say that societies with an intrinsic growth compulsion reach the limits of their developmental capacity when no land is left to be claimed, valorized, commodified, or profitably utilized. They soon begin to stagnate and decay. Landnahmen contain an expansion or growth paradox. Capitalism must expand in order to exist, yet in doing so, it gradually destroys that which it needs for its own reproduction. The more successful the accumulation and growth machine is, the stronger it undermines the capacity for self-reproduction of the social and natural resources without which modern capitalist societies cannot survive. The main problem of capitalism is not its crisis, it's its success. That's the idea behind Landnahme. The rainforest offers us a perfect example. Its commodification and productive utilization is for the most part linked to ecological destruction, which takes effect on a worldwide scale. That said, this fact does not imply any sort of automatism of collapse. Instead, the moment of potential systemic collapse is repeatedly delayed, deferred, seemingly indefinitely into the future through the aid of self-stabilization mechanisms, albeit ultimately at the cost of a renewed stimulation of expansive forces and a shift or perhaps even accumulation of the related potential for crisis and destruction. In the narrow definition of land grabbing, the category denotes practices applied by global agribusiness, corporations and state purchase agricultural land, often in cooperation with private investment funds in order to produce food crops or biofuels. One result is the displacement of small-scale farming as a form of land use in favor of the agro-industrial monoculture. I think you know this very well from Brazil, yes, it's not unknown in Brazil. From this narrow understanding of land grabbing, we must distinguish the term's connotation when used in the social scientific context, where Landnahme represents a category for the analysis of capitalist modes of development. In this context, the Landnahme theory introduces a specific analytical perspective, taking into account the relations of exchange between capitalist and non-capitalist territories, modes of production and living classes and strata. Apart from Marx, the Landnahme theorem has been discussed and refined by thinkers as diverse as Rosa Luxemburg, Hannah Arendt, feminists like Silvia Federici, German industrial sociologist Burkhard Lutz, and geographer David Harvey. More recently, the concept has been revisited by political economists such as Wolfgang Streeck and Riccardo Bellofiore, as well as by sociology more generally, in an effort to grasp in terms of diagnosis of the times, the metamorphosis of capitalism, which began in the 1970s. Drawing on the work of Karl Marx, no, that's not what I need. Drawing on the work of Karl Marx, Rosa Luxemburg and Silvia Federici, I would now like to introduce some important components of a theory of capitalist Landnahme. In the first part of my presentation, I confine myself to certain aspects in Marx and Luxemburg, as well as certain feminist approaches. In the second part, I will present a few examples of the finance capitalist Landnahme of the social. Let's start with Karl Marx and the primitive accumulation. Marx himself never actually used the L word, but he did produce an initial analysis of the basic form of capitalist Landnahme. Marx ironically compares to so-called primitive accumulation with the original sin in the Garden of Eden. Capitalism did not emerge out of nowhere, nor was it the result of excessive frugality on the part of the owners of wealth. The midwives of capitalism were the state and political coercion, as well as accumulation by violent dispossession, the theft of church property, the elimination of collective ownership of communal land, colonialism, and slavery. The separation of the producer from the means of production as the central precondition for the emergence of workers who are free in the double sense, and thus for the emergence of capitalism itself, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire, the last chapter in the first volume of Capital. Although we have advanced somewhat in terms of historical knowledge, the construct of primitive accumulation can nonetheless be used as an historical backdrop for reconstructing the core structure of capitalist Landnahme. Marx, however, believed that recourse to political coercion and even open violence would remain but a mere episode in capitalism's early days. In his view, a labor force would emerge over the course of history which, by education, tradition, and habit, looks upon the requirements of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws. Extra-economic violence would then only be applied in exceptional circumstances, while workers could for the most part be left to the natural laws of production. The silent compulsion of economic relations would ensure the domination of the capitalist over the worker. Marx. But this was a mistake, I think. Rosa Luxemburg would come to see things quite differently 55 years later. Her central argument posits that the capitalist dynamic can be understood as a systemic compulsion towards a periodically recurring phase of primitive accumulation. In macroeconomic terms, this compulsion is the result of the need for an expanded reproduction of capital, as well as in microeconomic terms of competition between individual capitals and the permanent increase of labor productivity. Luxemburg claims that it remains unclear in Marx's model of capital expanded reproduction as to how the surplus value produced in a given preceding production period could be realized in the subsequent period. Without resolving this realization problem, it is difficult to explain what could motivate investment in the first place. In order to overcome the obstacle posed by limited solvent demand and domestic markets, excess surplus value must be realized on external non-capitalist markets. For Luxemburg, then, this implies that the realization of excess surplus value can only occur outside of capitalist milieus. With the incorporation of non-capitalist labor and land, capital acquires a power of expansion that permits it to the augment of the elements of its accumulation beyond the limits apparently fixed by its own magnitude. Objectively speaking, close ties between non-capitalist strata and the accumulation of capital remain. Luxemburg's theory of external surplus value realization, you don't need the value theory of Marx to understand this. You also can do it with prices, yes. Important is the exchange of equivalents. I come back to this point. Luxemburg's theory of external surplus value realization sought to explain the imperialism of her era, but was by and large rejected by her fellow Marxists at the time. Kautsky, Hilferding, the establishment of the Marxists, yes. They said, Rosa Luxemburg, good fighter, bad in theory. That's a problem, yeah? I don't think so. But on quite accurate objection to her arguments was that Luxemburg had neglected the level of abstraction in the Marxian reproduction schemes in Capital Volume 2. While Marx ignores numerous influencing factors, non-capitalist modes of production, changes in labor productivity, the organic composition of capital, the world market, the function of credit, fluctuations in the rate of profit, Luxemburg explicitly reintroduces these concretions over the course of her argument. In a way, the criticism thus misses its target. That's right. That said, by including additional variables in her equitation, Luxemburg demonstrates quite clearly that the accumulation of capital by no means tends towards equilibrium, but rather causes disruptions and structural crisis in the long term, so that her argument must be regarded as positive and theoretical fruitful despite all its errors and false conclusions. This is the comment of Rostolsky. Perhaps somebody knows his comment on Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital. In my view, 4 of Luxemburg's considerations are particularly relevant to a modern theory of capitalist Landnahme. Firstly, Luxemburg convincingly demonstrates that the capitalist dynamic processes a dual structure. One movement occurs within the production sites of surplus value in the factories, the thoroughly capitalized agricultural sector, and on commodity markets. Here, capitalism largely reproduces itself from within, so to speak. The principle of exchange of equivalence tends to be valid, meaning that wage earners are remunerated in accordance with the value of their labor force, albeit mediated through social conflicts. Another development is refracted in the relations of exchange between capital accumulation on the one hand and non-capitalist modes of production, social strata and territories on the other. In identifying this double movement, Luxemburg highlights a development which began during the last third of the 19th century. No, as you cannot see here. It's the composition of global inequalities. It's the Gini coefficient, in German it's Gini coefficient, I think you know what it is. And it shows us the relations, the impact of class and the impact of citizenship to inequalities. And you see what happened. From a global perspective, the impact of classes shrinks, and the impact of citizenship, the location where you're born, rises. Yes? That's very important. That's the process that we have since 1870. Yes? What it not shows is the following. Now, I will come back to this point. Since more than 20 years, the impact of class growth and the impact of citizenship shrinks, is shrinking. And you see the results. That's the pyramid of global wealth shown by a research institute of a bank from Switzerland. And you see the top and you see the bottom. Yes, I think I don't need a comment. And that's what happened to salary in the industrialized world. You see the salary in relation to GDP, and you see the movement of salary. Yes, that's behind this, and you can see it in this chart. Coming back to Landnahme theory. Let me see. Ever since the speed and growth dynamic of the world economy have been dictated by an advanced or at least developing capitalist core dominating the remaining allegedly backward countries. The resulting locational advantage, that is the advantage to being born in a rich country, has increasingly come to determine the composition of global inequality over the decades and is a major factor in the configuration of worldwide migration flows, I should have showed. This implies, secondly, that the rational welfare state capitalisms of the North also possesses an outside which the centrists depreciate and subdue, not least through structural violence. Outside in this context does not necessarily mean outside of national borders. However, there are always regions, milieus, groups, and activities dominated by forms of exchange other than purely capitalist markets within national societies. The principle of exchange of equivalence is partially operative on these external markets at best. These areas are instead ruled by arbitrariness and in part by open violence. This violence can also be deployed with the aim of at least temporarily keeping certain social groups, territories, or entire states in a pre-capitalist or less developed state. Landnahmen redraw the borders between internal and external markets. The outcome is thus not a linear valorization of new land, rather the possibility of regression and a violent disciplinary regime is intrinsic to every Landnahme. Thirdly, the metabolism between internal and external capitalist markets amounts to the ongoing corrosion and assimilation of non-capitalist milieus over an extended period of time. The process, according to Luxemburg, leads to the most peculiar combinations between the modern wage system and primitive authority. Luxemburg analyzes such amalgamations with view to the collapse of traditional barter or peasant economies. Examples thereof include the systematic and deliberate efforts to destroy and disrupt communal property introduced as an element of French colonial policy in France's Arab colonies, or the forced wage labor which Spanish conquistadors introduced in the Latin American colonies to facilitate the exploitation of the indigenous population. One quite impressive case from a contemporary perspective is the forced labor of Egyptian fellahin employed to refinance government borrowing from international financial capital. In all three examples, Landnahme signifies that distinct forms of unfree, precarious, and only partially commodified labor are preserved across long-term historical periods, recombined and thereby harnessed as labor for capital. What emerges are hybrid combinations of wage labor and pre-capitalist forms of labor in varyingly structured markets whose metabolism promises extra profits for dominant actors. This is close to that what we have now in the modern world. I come back to this point. In contrast to the Marxist orthodoxy of her day, Luxemburg fourthly founded a completely independent approach to examining social formations, which stands in contrast with the linear and evolutionist conceptions of progress. This independent approach implies recognizing a limited plurality of antagonisms and relations of exploitation as being equally significant. Two fundamentally different modes of exploitation can be distinguished in terms of ideal types. Primary exploitation, because formation defining in capitalism rests on the principle of exchange of equivalence, labor power in return for equivalent remuneration. It is commonly embedded in contractual relations between free and equal partners on internal markets. It generally functions without any consideration for color, race, creed, gender, and any dependence upon extra economic inequality or difference. It's the argument of Alan Maxwell's Wood. This does not apply to secondary, because not specifically capitalist exploitation. Here, exploitation means to loot, to appropriate something by violent means something that was not produced by one's own labor, to take something without giving something of equal value in. It's the argument of Maria Mies. Feminist authors have taken this idea to even more radical conclusions. Silvia Federici criticizes Marx for failing to take the violence women faced during the process of primitive accumulation into account. She analyzes the emergence of capitalism as a response to the class struggles of the feudal era by the ruling powers. To Federici, the persecution of alleged witches represents a specific form of violence directed against women, rendering the female body accessible. The body becomes the women's factory, so to speak. Control over this body generates an independent mode of production, the devaluation of which in turn represents a structural characteristic of capitalism. The exploitation of those activities responsible for producing labor power in the first place is realized by men, many of whom belong to the subordinated classes as well. Maria Mies and other authors associated with the so-called Bielefeld approach. Do you know Bielefeld? It's a town in Germany. You must, I think you wouldn't find it if you are not invited. It's the same like Caxambu, yeah. But the Bielefeld approach is for feminists very, very important. Maria Mies and other authors associated with the Bielefeld approach have analyzed such relations of dominance with view to subsistence labor. The ongoing care work debate is returning to some of these insights, albeit under a different banner. Private economic or state interests in maintaining low production costs can act as a powerful motive for utilizing care work free of charge or turning into an object of secondary exploitation. Gendered and racialized constructs are particularly well suited to classify individuals or groups of people in social hierarchies, facilitating a regulation of the metabolism between internal and external markets in the field of social reproduction in a way which keeps the price of paid care work artificially low. Struggles in this field are often linked to the shifting boundaries between paid and unpaid work. We can establish the following. Landnahme not only affect paid gainful employment, but extended across the entire range of human activities. Moreover, they can utilize subsistence work and care work as a colony, as new land to be commodified, commercialized, assimilated, and thereby gradually ruined. This is what the crisis of social reproduction means. Let me summarize. Capitalist Landnahme, we can now establish, generates an oftentimes violent inside-outside dialectic. Due to certain mechanisms which deserve closer scrutiny, this form of movement is linked to B, reappreciations or depreciations of non-market conforming other. Landnahme signifies C, the commodification, monetization, and commercialization of this other, and thus simultaneously is gradual assimilation and destruction. As a result, Landnahmen are definite. Once a non-capitalist other has been absorbed, the expansive dynamic begins to lose momentum. Because they are propelled forward by property as a dynamic principle and result in expanded reproduction and market expansion, Landnahme are highly contested. What is more, they are always tied to a surrender of land. In the accumulation of G, bureaucratic political power, I haven't explained that, it's from Hannah Arendt, of a bureaucratic political power, market-driven Landnahmen encounter an expansive counterpart which can unfold in a tension-filled co-evolution with the expanded reproduction of capital, but also when decoupled from it. Every phase of economic prosperity can be interpreted as an historical, unique, spatio-temporally limited Landnahme forming its own particular modus operandi. Once a specific modus operandi of capitalist Landnahme becomes dysfunctional, major crisis of capital accumulation and social reproduction, which can branch out into the most diverse paths of social development, can result. I believe we are currently in the midst of such a transition point, the main cause of which I consider to be a finance capitalist Landnahme which reached its limits as a hegemonic growth project following the crisis of 2007-9. This specific occupation can be understood as a Landnahme of the second order, occupying land which was already occupied previously. Or, to put it in less abstract terms, it shifts the boundaries of capitalist Landnahmen through the curtailment and expropriation of social property in the old capitalist centers, I have to say. Social property denotes welfare state guaranteed property designed to ensure collective livelihood, which transformed the wealthy countries of the global north into a gigantic machine of social integration. Social property consists of, for instance, collective social security systems, collective bargaining norms, rights to co-determination or participation, or labor law. Welfare state regulation, in turn, implies a partial decommodification of wage labor and an internalization of social costs at capital's expense. This barrier to accumulation is currently being dispensed over the course of Landnahme of the social in the affluent societies of the global north. The modus operandi for this particularly Landnahme depends mainly on the privatization of public goods, market deregulation, and excessive flexibilization and precarization of labor. I give you one example. I think it's only time for one example. Let's see. Yes. The first example I will give is shareholder value-oriented business management in large corporations in Germany and Europe. Over the course of large corporations' reorientation towards short-term profits, the co-determined, negotiated company and organized industrial relations have become the object of Landnahme. Corporate and public policies of recommodification have led to a situation in which claims to social property are curtailed and reduced public goods are distributed more selectively. Landnahme in this case means that the protective shell of the welfare state, which imbued wage labor with a certain social status, is being worn away layer by layer. This occurs, for instance, as a result of the rationalization and the internalization of value chains. As companies are split up, the regulation of wages and working hours increasingly takes place across two separate worlds. The shrinking first world, collective bargaining agreements and co-determination, and thus the status of social citizen for wage earners remains somewhat intact. Beyond this world, in the second world of deregulated labor, this is no longer the case. In some instances, it suffices to aim the employment contract to create an external market of workforce within individual companies. These workforces then no longer need to be paid according to the common standard. One example of this is the privatized German postal service, which founded a subsidiary in which employees were paid up to 30% less than staff at the parent company. A fierce labor struggle managed to secure employees' worthwhile status in the original company. Through this was not possible at the expanding subsidiary. Yes, and so you have workers of two classes. Yes, they do the same jobs. The staff makes the jobs in the first world, in the regulated world, with high salaries and collective bargaining and so on. And then you took out a part of the workforce, and with new contracts, they are part of a new enterprise, and they do the same jobs, but with less salary, less benefits, and so on. Yes, and you have not only two classes. In most of the large enterprises, you have 5 or 6 classes. Yes. This demonstrates the extent of which the border regime between both worlds is structurally conflict-prone. At the same time, however, trade unions face a difficult time asserting themselves in this new environment. Union density in Germany has dropped to 18%, while the European average is 23%. Only a minority of employees are members of unions. Yes? Under these conditions, core workforces of export sector companies tend to develop a form of exclusive solidarity, although they continue to express solidarity. They do so only among their own kind, so to speak. Moreover, they distance themselves not only from the owners or managers, but from the other and below as well. Thus it is by no means a contradiction in terms to actively participate in a labor struggle while supporting a right populist or even right-wing extremist party at the same time. The less realistic achieving any kind of success in the distributional struggle between above and below appears, the more likely they are to conceive of such disputes as conflicts between the inside and the outside, between natives and migrants. A permanent employment contract increasingly seems like a privilege worth fighting for tooth and nail, with the deployment of prejudices against others becoming the most important tool in the fight to preserve one's social status. You see there, it's the result of a research in large human car plant, 7,000 white and blue collar workers, and then you see the first item. We made a research, we interviewed the blue collar workers, the white collar workers, which are engineers or working at the offices and so on, and also the management, yes. And then you see, I can't read it from this point, the item is that society which builds social networks for everyone cannot survive in future. And you see 51% of the blue collar workers say yes. Yes. And the union density of these workers is 99%. They can realize solidarity, but only within the staff. Yes? Not for the temporary workers and the long-time unemployed. You can see this at this chart, at the right side. We asked them if we need more pressure for the long-time unemployed. And 54% of the blue-collar workers said yes, more pressure. Yes. 99% in trade unions. Yes. This was unbelievable. When we presented the results to the Works Council, he said the colleagues didn't understand the questions. And then we made a qualitative research, yeah, and we only asked activists from trade union, and we had the same result. Yes, they said, I have nothing against long-time unemployed, but I'm sure 50% of them don't want to work. I have nothing against migrants, but I'm sure most of them wanted to work. They want to invite the systems of social security. Yes, I show you more. That's the second mechanism of the finance capitalist Landnahme of the social. One result is that that the labor market is split in three zones. You have the zone of integration. There are all blue and white collar workers who are safe, with good conditions, good salaries, and so on. You have the zone of disaffiliation. This is from Robert Castel, yes, where all the people who have no chance to get in the regular labor market, yeah, and in between there is a zone of vulnerability or precarity, where all the people are who are needed precarious jobs to survive. And that what happened in Germany is you have these three zones in all European societies. Nowadays also in the Nordic society, Sweden, for example, the relations between the zones, they are varying. That's crystal clear. Yes, in Germany, I would say in the first zone there are 50% of the employees. Yes, but more than 30 are in the zone of in the B and Z zone. Yes, and there are 20% which are mobile and change the zones. Yes, but I show you what happened in Germany. It's another example for the Landnahme of the social. That what we see is the rise of precarious full employment society in Germany. Gainful employment is on a record high. More than 44 million are working now. Yes, that's a record high since 1989, and for West Germany since 1949. On the one hand, yes, you have shrinking unemployment. But if you look to the volume of paid work, you can see that the volume of paid work for each worker in 2013 is lower than in 1991. The difference is 12%. We can say, wonderful, yes, we can live with less work, but the working time is polarized, yes. The workers who are qualified with high skills, they are working 60, 70 hours a week, and the precarious people only 12 hours a week with less money, yes, for example. It's a polarization of working time. So you can see what precarious full employment society means. Why it? That's that one. Means that. You see, between 2000, I think 2000, I don't know it exactly, I can't see. Sorry. Between 2000 and 2014, we have shrinking unemployment, 1 million. But we also have shrinking full-time employment, 1.5 million. And we have more employees, more than 2 million. Why? We have an expansion of precarious and so-called atypical forms of employment. I say so-called atypical, which means temporary agency workers, contract workers, and so on. I say so-called because we have branches where the majority is working under precarious and so-called atypical conditions. Yeah, for example, in the hotels and so on. Yes, and that's not the full. That's not the full impression, because what you can see here is the expansion of the minimum wage of the low wage sector in Germany. 22 to 25% of the workforce is working at the low wage sector. The low wage sector expands, and it's only behind Baltic Republic. Yes, it's one of the biggest low wage sectors in the OECD world. In Germany now. Yes, and the new minimum wage creates better conditions for the precarious living people, but to get the minimum wage is to work in the low wage sector. Yes, it's a low wage, the minimum wage. Yeah, for Brazilian conditions may be good, €8.50, but in Germany, in Germany you can't live with that. Yes, and if you get the minimum wage for your whole working life, then you are under precarious conditions. You must live under precarious conditions when you are a pensioner. Yes, that's what's behind the German job miracle. I must come to an end. Okay. So I can't give you the example of Greece, which is a kind of external Landnahme. Perhaps I can say something about in the discussion about Germany, the situation, European Union and the Eurozone, and I will come to my conclusions. The examples demonstrate that the finance capitalist Landnahme draws on social mechanisms which exert structural violence. The finance capitalist center, in this case, is stabilizing itself at the cost of all those who are forced to work and live under precarious conditions. It is a specifically finance capitalist modus operandi because it allows for exploitation by a rentier class who are in a position to use the expanding financial sector to levy a modern form of ground rent. This financial modus operandi can only be stabilized through the constant injection of new land, which means financial assets social capital into the capital cycle. And because the financial sector's economy expands more rapidly than the productive economy, the latter is constantly confronted with nearly impossible profitability targets. One outcome is that the national economies of the old capitalist centers have definitely left behind the era of rapid permanent growth. Financial market capitalism, both a product and institutional pillar of the process known as globalization, is beginning to morph into a gradually and, more importantly, unevenly expanding post-growth capitalism in the old centers. Let us recapitulate. The finance capitalist Landnahme on the social has advanced to a point where it has begun to damage the self-stabilization mechanisms of the capitalist dynamic. The precarization of work and employment relations and a class struggle waged from above in the context of globalization have weakened or crippled the most important forces of any political economy of the labor force. Trade unions, democratic and socialist parties, and curtailed welfare state institutions, market restricting role to such an extent that even redistributive measures designed to stabilize the system have ceased to function. It is for this reason that precarious work and employment relations act as a lead weight attached to wages. Productivity stagnates, inequalities are on rise. This is the term this in turn decelerates growth, generates uncertainty, and limits the willingness to innovate on the part of business and the state. At the same time, the ecological axis of conflict is at least temporarily being pushed into the background in favor of growth targets. These constitute the very characteristics of a post-growth capitalism, which, as it were, is the beginning to take hold in the old capitalist centers. That's the situation now. Are there alternatives? It's impossible to make the speech about alternatives in this minutes, but what I can say at my last, what's my last argument is sociologists can do not so much to change the world and to find alternatives. But critical public sociology, as proposed by Michael Burrow, however, may indeed help create the public spaces in which we could explore, in the spirit of democratic experimentalism, which ideas can stand the test of practice. All of us carry a responsibility to work together in making such an experimentalism possible. There is no guarantee of success, but to dare or to try this by all means better than to simply stand aside and indulge in one's powerlessness. So I think that's what we have to do globally, also in cooperation of sociologists and social scientists in the North and the South. And as you told it, I'm one of the new editors of the Global Dialogue, and we need a lot of contributors for this debate, and I hope you will find a lot of contributors in Brazil too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus. Obrigado. Nós estamos com a hora já avançada, mas queríamos abrir, né, pelo menos para uma rodada de questões, perguntas, sugestões. debate aberto. Vou anotar aqui então inscrições.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for a stimulating talk. I really like the big picture thinking that you're engaged in. And I have a question. I don't know whether it's a doubt or a request for a clarification. I understand you to begin with the metaphor that the regularized exchange of equivalents that characterizes the center during the expansion of capitalism was once thought of as a territory, and the territory into which it expanded, which was non-capitalist and characterized by the accumulation of wealth or the genesis of profit through violence and theft, was also once conceived of as a territory. So Landnahme assumes that regularized exchange of equivalents and primitive accumulation are separated territorially. And this model predicts that once capitalism has run out of non-capitalist land in which to expand, it will face a crisis and destroy itself. But you also traced an intellectual history in which it was recognized that the difference between the regularized exchange of equivalents region and the primitive accumulation region was not really territorial. And the expansion of capital from regularized places into unregularized places is not linear, because in fact, within the center, it can turn spaces and populations that once earned regularly through the exchange of equivalences into areas of violent accumulation. And that furthermore, the center has always been stratified with respect to which subpopulations could benefit from the regularized exchange of equivalents, stratified by gender, by race, by region, etc. So I'm wondering whether the prediction of running out of land to expand into isn't actually contradicted by the subsequent argument you've given. In other words, capitalism can always create new areas of primitive accumulation even within the center, which does not lend itself to the prediction that suddenly capitalism is going to destroy itself. It keeps recreating new areas of primitive accumulation. So does that mean that perhaps the metaphor of Landnahme actually confuses matters, that if we focus on Land, on territorialism, we are actually failing to recognize the non-territorial dynamic that can actually continue for a long time? Are you with me?
The question is if you could talk a little bit about the use of Landnahme as an heuristic device in concrete situations, what we should be aware of, so that it doesn't become just one rationality that one identify everywhere, but it's not really an analytical device. The question is if you can speak a little bit more about using Landnahme as an analytical device, so not to reify a rationality that you just, sort of identify and point out like being the same thing everywhere.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. First question, I would say I have to differentiate it between external Landnahme on the one hand and internal Landnahme on the other. That is one differentiation, yeah, and that is why Landnahme is not the same as imperialism. You can have an imperialism inside your national society. For example, to make it clear, the Fordist period of accumulation was a process of ongoing Landnahme. Why? In Germany, it destroys the so-called traditional sector, the sector of agriculture, the sector of craft production, and so on. Yes, and it was important for the Fordist accumulation because the accumulation process needs the workforce of the traditional sector for the factories and the mass production and so on. But the German industrial sociologist Burkhard Lutz, he was the man who uses the term Landnahme at the first place as a sociologist in Germany. He said, you can compare that with imperialism. Yes, but it's an inside imperialism. So, come back to your question. Territory is only one aspect of Landnahme. It's an important aspect. Yes, I would say the producing of space is in the understanding of David Harvey, for example, one of the most important self-stabilizing mechanisms of capitalism, because you can destroy capital fixes, for example in Germany, to go to China with steel production, and there you have built new fixes, but the destroyed region, it's the German Ruhrgebiet, yes, you can bring back the people and the territory in the accumulation process under new conditions. That's the idea behind manufacturing a new land. Yes. So maybe the question is, oh, I'm the bad guy, sorry. So the question is, can there be an end? Yes, and yeah, how Luxembourg, this was the, yeah. Is there an end of capitalist Landnahme? I don't know. If I talked about the ecological pincer grip crisis, from my understanding, the global crisis of 2007 to 9 is a signal for a deeper crisis, which I call economic ecological pincer grip crisis. Why economic ecological pincer grip crisis? It's because the most important thing to stabilize capitalist dynamic is to generate economic growth. But now, under the conditions of fossil production and reproduction, the generation of economic growth has as its result the destabilization of ecosystems. And nobody of us knew if this is an absolute border for capital accumulation. I would say not today, but maybe there is a point in 30, 40, 50 years where we have a point of no return. I'll give you an example. Rio de Janeiro. If the people who are studying the climate change are right, then in 50 years maybe the wonderful town Rio de Janeiro, I love it, is underwater. But in Rio, nobody believes that. Yes, I talked to the people and they said, oh, no, maybe that's part of the problem, yes? So I would say there is not an end of capitalism, how Wolfgang Streeck interpreted it in the sense that we have a global crash of the system, yes? No, I think there's only an end of capitalism when we have subjects, not only working classes and organizations, more antagonisms, more forms of exploitation and so on. That's the idea behind Landnahme. That gave the system, which draws the system, or changed the system into another, yes? That's what we have to discuss, and not automatically a collapse of the capitalism. I don't believe that we will see that, yes? And the other question was more how to use Landnahme as a research concept, yes? I think you can't analyze Landnahme only theoretically from a top-down perspective. It's necessary to study the processes in each field, yes? And we have different transfer mechanisms of Landnahme. The shareholder value is one transfer mechanism. Yeah, another mechanism is Landnahme by credit. Yeah, by debt. Yes, this would be the Greece example. Yes, and so we need empiric research of all the different fields in society to identify the processes of Landnahme, and it's necessary that we don't only have a research on the Landnahme processes, we need also research on the counter forces, the counter Landnahme. There is no Landnahme without counter Landnahme. I didn't spoke about that counter Landnahme, the social movements, and so on, but that's very important to understand Landnahme, yes? And this is only possible in a way to make empirical research, but to understand what you find with empirical research, you need a construction of society to have a context to interpret that what happens in your fields. That's necessary, I think, and therefore the concept of capitalist Landnahme may be good or not. You have to decide it. Okay.
Thanks, Klaus. Obrigado a todos, a todas, os resistentes do último dia de ANPOCS, nessa hora já avançada da conferência. Eu queria agradecer muito então, a presença de vocês, o debate, a conferência do professor Klaus Dörre, que em breve, imagino, esteja também disponível no site da ANPOCS. Obrigado.